Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista for the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion for Monday, June 13th, 2022. Of course, we got a couple things to go on to talk about today, including, of course, an area of interest in the Atlantic and several, including one being Invest 92E in the East Pac. A lot of stuff to go over today, so let's dive right in, of course, since we have a lot to talk about. But before we get to talking about the NHC outlook for the Atlantic and the East Pac, I want to get to this map right here, which is the June 11th to 20th tropical cyclone points of origin. So, in other words, climatology in the Atlantic. And this is very important to keep and monitor because this basically tells us the long-term trends that we've seen in the Atlantic. And that's really important, especially when it comes to looking at for development and determining whether or not whether or not development that we see is out of the norm or not. And of course, what we do want to talk about is where we generally see the development in the points of origin in the mid-June time frame, which is basically this is hinting at. And one thing you do notice is the general idea that we usually get a lot of activity, basically all out here, all in here in the Western Caribbean and of course in the Eastern Pacific close to Mexico, because that's where we have the Central American gyres going on, and that's where most of the favorable conditions are. Even for the East Pac too, most of the favorable conditions are usually closer to Mexico early on in the season, and the Atlantic closer to the Western Atlantic is where we see a lot of development typically take place. And if we take a look at where our AOI is, which is right down here, we've had a couple of developments in the last few years um, occur within June 11th to June 20th. Of course, in the Western Caribbean. So basically, this is something to keep in mind, because especially when it comes to talking about what's down here, we got to keep in mind that this is a favored area for development this time of year. So that means climatology. This has the climatology to back it in order to develop, which would give another reason why we should watch this very closely, which, by the way, the NHC has actually upped this to a 40% chance as of the 2 p.m. advisory, I think. Of course, they mentioned that there's actually a broad area of disturbed weather over the southwestern Caribbean, and there's already a surface trough or low pressure, and there might be some development over the week, and we could see, they're now mentioning that we could see a tropical depression form by late this week if the system remains over water. If it remains over water, it will actually be key, because a lot of the models get this going very close to the Central American coast, then kind of have this crashing into the Central American coast, and then not really being over a decent stretch of water until it gets to the Bay of Campeche. Now, if this actually goes over the water and stays longer over the water, we might see this develop earlier, and you'll see why. The general idea of that is very important in a little bit when we go over the models, but that's the Atlantic side. Of course, in the Eastern Pacific, nothing new. We got 92E out in the Eastern Pacific. That has a 90 both the 40-hour and 5-day has a 90 chance to develop. So basically, it's a guarantee that this will develop into something. Sorry, my phone's going off. Um, and so basically, we already know that this will definitely form into something of interest, and most of the models do agree with that. And then, of course, we have this area that's closer to the Central American coast, right around Mexico and Guatemala, generally the Central American area. This is a 30% chance within the next 5 days, and a 48 and in the next 48 hours, a 20% chance. And models do have something spinning up generally within the same time frame, as we do get something out here in the Southwest Atlantic and the Southwestern Caribbean. So this will be something we'll need to watch too, especially that this will form closer to Central America, so we might get a threat too on the East Pac side of things around that time. Before we go into anything else in the current systems we got, though, I do want to talk about the sea surface temperature anomalies, as of course it's Monday, not Wednesday, but Monday, the beginning of a new week. So I guess a beginning of the new scenery as to what we are going to expect with the sea surface temperature anomalies. And what else is there to say other than the same things? The MDR is pretty decently above normal, and it's actually interesting because the MDR has been warming despite trade winds so far, so we really need to watch that. The Gulf, especially the northern Gulf, is real warm. I saw some shelf waters on some of the sea surface temperature plots across the northern Gulf. A lot of the places near the Louisiana coast are showing up at 30 degrees Celsius closer to the shelf water. And it really isn't much to talk about because there isn't any storm. There ain't no storm taking advantage of any of this. But of course, I guess the one thing I'll give to you is, of course, once there's a storm out here and the conditions are favorable at the time the storm is going by, especially later on in the season when we get towards late August and September, when we start seeing a lot of activity increase in the Atlantic in general, and of course is notorious around that time too for Gulf of Mexico development. If this holds, which given the pattern with the ridge over the United States that is forecasted, and we'll also get to the ridging and the forecasts that relate to that in a little bit, because we also have stuff to talk about with that today. But especially when it comes to those things, it really does favor the Gulf of Mexico warming, especially when we have a huge ridge of high pressure. Not much in the way of fronts. Well, already, because it's summer, we won't have too much in the way of fronts, but especially when we have a lot of heat over the United States, which is, especially during the summertime, usually heat-induced, ridge-induced, that really does help the Gulf of Mexico warm up, and that's why we're seeing such these warm anomalies in the northern Gulf too. And this is something we really need to watch very closely. But also, when it comes to development, notice we're in the southwestern Caribbean where this thing is, this area of interest that the National Hurricane Center has. And of course, we're also watching for development to look around that area. We have some noticeably above normal sea surface temperature anomalies. And as we get towards the northern Caribbean, they do kind of get closer towards the average. I should say some small areas of below normal, but it's the Caribbean, and even with this area that's quote unquote average, the sea surface temperatures plots are still 28, 29 degrees Celsius even, and that in itself is more than enough for something to develop, especially when it comes to a weak storm. You really only need 26 degrees Celsius for a weak storm to form. Of course, stronger storms you need much more, but a weak storm, this is already enough. So this is really nothing to worry about when it comes to development. But the Eastern Pacific, the La Nina, even climate models too, that new climate models that have been released for the La Nina, the CPC IRI forecasting it to basically remain even through the peak season possibly. The Eastern Pacific though, the negative PMM, the negative PDO remaining a thing, and that's going to keep the Eastern Pacific in check generally. And this generally, the whole bigger picture, it's just the Atlantic is favored this year, and there's really no other way around it. The Atlantic is favored. We might see a lot of activity, a lot of forecasts going towards a hyperactive season. There's really no other way of saying it other than just things look very favorable this year, and this is something we'll need to watch very closely because, this could be a big year. And we'll have to see how all of this evolves. We're already into June, already into hurricane season, and we're still looking at the same exact setup that is going to favor a pretty active season, even hyperactive, if you ask me. We'll just have to see, but of course, things not looking good for us, of course, and we'll have to watch how things go. But I'm just generally going to talk about 92E, which is in the Pacific, of course. Still kind of struggling with its organization a little bit. I do see a little bit of shear with the storm, but I mean, there's a lot of deep convection, and the storm is trying to get organized, and the general model consensus is that this will organize into a storm. So we'll have to see. The tracks do, though, if this does form into a storm, which again is likely to. Most of the models to keep this off the coast of Mexico, so this is no threat to land. Of course, when it comes to rip currents, that'll be another thing, but the general consensus is off the coast of Mexico, nothing to worry about. Intensity, though, too, is actually a little interesting because I think this did uptrend a little bit from the past few days. Most of the models are, interestingly enough, going with the hurricane, some of them going as strong as a high-end Category 1, Most of them are around the low to mid-range category 1, but that'll be interesting because I don't remember the last time we got the first two storms in the Eastern Pacific as hurricanes. I know we've gotten it in years like 2015. Oh no, 2018 I think was the last time we got the first two storms in the Eastern Pacific. No, actually 2019. One of those 2 years, the first two storms we got in the Eastern Pacific were hurricanes. So it'll be interesting for sure that we'll get the first two storms in the Eastern Pacific as hurricanes. It really doesn't mean much since the Eastern Pacific is usually most active early on when the Atlantic is in its early season. The Eastern Pacific tends to get active around this time period with multiple storms spinning up, but nonetheless interesting. The general satellite out in the Atlantic, nothing really to write home about, of course, except the Caribbean area, which we'll zoom in on it a little bit closely. But a lot of Saharan air, very typical for June. Strong upper level shear, strong upper level winds, obviously indicative of shear. That's obviously a thing that's out there in the Atlantic, also typical of June. So don't need to be worried about any of those things for development because they're all typical and nothing to really need to worry about. But interesting, we got a couple of these strong tropical waves. I'd say especially strong for early June, and I've actually seen some models trying to hint at some more strong tropical waves coming off the coast of Africa and a little bit more northerly too, I think. So it'll be something interesting to watch to see if we get any of those storms form in the MDR. Of course, we don't usually typically see those in June, and the last time we saw one was in 2017 and last year too. And of course, later that year in 2017, we had the absolute nightmare of a season that we had in 2021, even too. Also had its fair share of storms. So we'll see if something does develop out here in the MDR. Typically we don't watch, but models do like to sometimes hint at a few things, and models have been of some small tropical waves, nothing big, but really just something small, but still something. Zooming in on the Caribbean, we're seeing that convection blow up. There's convergence from the trades in the Atlantic, and of course the westerlies associated with this big MJO that we're talking about, that's creating convergence over here nearby Central America, and that's also helping with the formation of a Central American gyre, which is typically the culprit of a bunch of these early season storms in both the East Pac and the Atlantic. And that's where we're seeing a lot of this convergence. But this will be interesting too. We'll need to watch this area specific, because if this convection, of course, persists, that'll be a breeding ground for low pressure to develop, and of course, a better chance for something to try to spin up. It all just depends on what exactly happens. And we can already see too, either way, the NHC roughly where they have their AOY marked. You do notice that there is actually a vorticity clump. It's not too clumped together, too rounded like we usually like to see with tropical cyclones. It's very elongated, but Salt talks about that there's some sort of mid-level circulation right by Colombia, and that's where that is right now. The NHC has it tagged as the area that they're watching, and of course there's a lot of convection right around that area, so very interesting. We'll need to watch for sure. The shear right now though is I guess it could definitely use a little bit better. Of course, the shear in general across the whole Atlantic, very strong. In the deep tropics, the subtropics, not as strong. It's still typical. We're still in the early season. Things still need to transfer from the subtropics to the deep tropics, and especially with the pattern that we're looking at this year, it'll definitely do so soon. And of course, in the southwestern Caribbean, though, there is some lower shear compared to the rest of the deep tropics. And of course, as the days goes by, the models are forecasting the shear to decrease. And speaking of the models, it's now time to look at the models and see what they show. The GFS basically showing what we think right now around hour 6. Notice that low pressure. Roughly what I'm talking about, a low pressure, it's basically this area right here. That's what the GFS has. And notice how neatly the GFS spins it up pretty quickly. But and that is a bias of the GFS that we do need to watch, because sometimes these biases can get in the way of when it comes to forecasting. But nonetheless, the GFS tries to spin something up, has a pretty decent storm into the Yucatan around Belize. But of course, that's a bias, and then it kind of takes us into the Yucatan. Doesn't really emerge this much over the Bay of Campeche, but when it comes to that part, it's still a little bit further out. And I guess why the GFS has been hinting at such quick development is if we go towards back to the analysis, around hour 6, you do notice once again a lot of strong shear across the Caribbean and the deep tropics, of course, expected. And you do notice here, especially when it comes to the lower shear over the Gulf of Mexico, some sort of upper level ridge. I'm thinking that's kind of keeping things with the shear a little bit low over the Caribbean. But do notice that as we go over time, notice that these winds are kind of fanning away from where the low pressure is. I'm going to show you where the low pressure is right around here. And the GFS, you notice with there are a lot of these winds in the upper levels that are kind of fanning away. And what we like to think of that is outflow. And it's basically air that's evacuating from the surface, and it's allowing for air underneath to rise up and allow for convection and development, which is what the GFS has. And it actually shows it over time developing, and this is actually a pretty decent upper level ULAC, which is what we like to call an upper level anticyclone. And basically that's just fancy for upper level winds are going away from the low pressure, and in turn that tends to allow for winds at the surface to come in, and that's what we know as rising motion, and that's what really helps thunderstorms develop, and that's what the GFS has. And then of course, because it does keep in mind, it does have a bias, and it does pretty quick develop this into a pretty intense storm, but the general idea is there, and the other models are on top of this. So this is definitely something we'll need to watch for sure. The European, let's look at that, doesn't really have as much of a system. We'll have to look at the vorticity for this one. And you do notice once again, it does kind of keep us a little bit further south. I'm assuming because it has a much stronger ridge than the GFS, and there's also a bias there too. The European does tend to hint at some pretty strong ridging, but notice too that it still does try to develop this into a storm, and then once this gets into the Bay of Campeche, it actually does do a little bit more than it does in the Caribbean. It does at least try to spin it up into something, and you can see pretty clearly it's traceable from the area that the NHC has tagged in the Caribbean, of course. And actually, really quickly, I got the European ensembles pulled up. And one thing you do notice too, they have a pretty good consensus that there will be some sort of low pressure that does try to develop. And of course, that area that the NHC has tagged closer to Central America, they have that tag too, and you can see there's a pretty good consensus on the European. That's something will try to come out of it too. But the European ensembles generally do back that there will be something that tries to get going. So of course, it does mean, of course, do need to watch, especially that this will be close to land and close to Central America. And there's quite a good consensus that the European is trying to spin up something in the Southern Caribbean. It's not even the GFS, it's all the models too. So that's definitely why the NHC has tagged this, and definitely why we need to watch really closely, because it does seem like things will come together for something to get together. So that's certainly something very interesting, and we all know that by now. Alright, so just really quickly before we end, Eric Webb did talk about the C3S ensemble, 8 climate models basically put together into an ensemble. And the June release of the forecast has come out, and Eric Webb did, the June release of the forecast has come out, and Eric Webb is talking about it today, hinting at what he does call the precipitation anomalies over Africa and through the deep tropics of the main development region are pretty above normal, and you can clearly see that here. Lots of above normal precipitation forecasted across the deep tropics of the Atlantic, and he does note that a lot of the models too, the probability for SSTs differing from the median. Notice too a lot of that having above normal hints throughout the deep tropics as well. That pretty positive AMO look too, with the horseshoe coming from Greenland down into the Canary Current and then into the MDR. That's a very classic look. And he does mention that this SST configuration signals deep layer instability over the Atlantic. And he does mention that this is something many seasons, including 2020 and last year, which is especially why we've had trouble getting those real monster storms to develop across the Atlantic. The reason why we've been struggling with that is the deep layer instability because of the SST configuration. Eric Webb is saying that what this year, it much more favors that type of instability over the Atlantic than the past few years, and they've been struggling with it a lot lately. And I'm going to go to Andy Hazelton really quickly because he has something on the ridging that the CS3 did put out. Something like here. Hold on, let me try to find it. But he did talk about a tweet where they were talking about the ridging pattern, which the CS3, the C3S, I think, had. And he did actually mention something. Oh, here it is. Similar. It's actually Danny Morris that talked about it, not Andy. I'm getting my people mixed up. Similar to 2020, the wetter tropical Atlantic will imply more of a Cape Verde season, which something 2020 did lack. And he also does mention that the steering, which we look for the June forecast, one thing we do notice about the steering is this huge ridge that's just strung out across the entire northern Atlantic. And what he's talking about, especially when it comes to long trackers, is because of the high amount of precip that the models are forecasting, and you combine that with the huge ridge that's over the northern Atlantic, there isn't really a signal much at all for anything to really recurve or trough to kind of take the storm and recurve it out to sea. There's not much of a signal of that at all. In fact, most of this just favors all these storms going westward. So if we combine that, and especially with the more favorable deep tropics, and especially when we do get storms that develop far east, and if they track westward long enough, that would really favor a hyperactive high ACE season, like a lot of the models are forecasting, like the European with their up to 225 ACE forecast. So this is really something we need to watch too, and especially for the Western Atlantic. People in the Western Atlantic, the Caribbean, there's been a lot of talks about 2007, which, by the way, did have 2 Category 5s in the Caribbean, also in short succession too. That was a big year for the Caribbean, not as much for the United States, but I do see indications more that the United States will still be in play here because it's generally the Western Atlantic, and of course we've seen the last few years, but that's besides the point. The general point is the pattern favors the Atlantic to be active, and besides that, it also favors a pattern that would allow storms to track west instead of out to sea. Basically, a very concerning look overall. And you combine that all together, this really does look like an interesting season ahead, and we'll be certainly on top to watch it very closely, of course. Throughout the season, we'll just see how things evolve from here, but certainly something very interesting for sure to watch. But besides that, of course, we'll continue to watch the Atlantic interest area, 92E out in the Pacific, and of course that other area too. And of course, whatever else does develop throughout the season, I have you all covered. Please, I will say this, so it will really mean a lot to me if you go ahead and subscribe, like the video, share with family and friends. Really help get this channel going so we can really help people get notified in storms. That's really what my goal is, to get people to get notified of things coming, and that's really what I'm trying to do. Not for the hype or anything. I'm just really trying to get people notified, and that's my goal, and I would really appreciate it if you could help me do that by getting people to this channel in the first place. I would really appreciate it, so please do it, and it's also free to subscribe, and you can unsubscribe whenever you want, so that's also another plus too. Besides that though, everybody have a great rest of your afternoon. Of course, we'll talk again tomorrow since there's obviously a lot to talk about, but until then, we'll see you, and have a good evening. Stay tuned. Stay tuned, stay safe, and peace.